Thanks for tuning in to Ginandtantra, Spirituality with a Twist. You have Daniel on the mic with you today. Eric is still on a bit of a sabbatical, we could call it. Unpaid vacation, because this is not paid. So therefore, his vacation is also unpaid. But he'll be back with us soon. However, sitting in the co-pilot chair today, I know we always use ship references for this thing, you know? I don't know if we call it the mothership, but I'm not sure if it's like an alien craft or like a ship. Like on the water of some type. But anyways, my co-captain here today is a friend of the show, frequent guest, Priscilla. Say hi.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us. Just keep in mind this is audio and video, so you know the audio folks can't see you wave, but maybe they could hear the subtle hint of wind passing by the mic. Is a whoosh, just subtle whoosh. Anyways, thanks for coming on here and chatting with me today. I appreciate it. We were just well, audience knows because we talk about pre-show meetings and things like this. So we were just talking about how I've been the main driver of the ship here for the last few episodes, and I was like, oh, I'm doing it by myself, but then in reality, like much to the point of our episode today, I'm totally not, because I've had on fantastic people to chat with, including yourself. So it's definitely not by myself. It's with all these wonderful human beings. I'm assuming you're a human. You appear to be, but if not, I accept you for who you are. All right, well let's get started. So the title of this episode probably going to be like boundary and vulnerability, something along these lines, right? And we do want to discuss these things today, as this has been something that Priscilla, you had brought up the other day, and
I called you and told you a story.
Right, yes, that's how, right. And so that brought up one piece.
Yeah, my brain works in like pictures sometimes, and sometimes I'll like be watching something in real life. I'm like, oh man, that like relates to me on a bigger level, and then I have to call you and tell you about it sometimes.
Yeah. Well, and I think, but that's the point, right? Is that like you can take the experience, the fodder from your life, and use it in your own like development. You know what I'm saying? So, and I think that happens for most people. I do think that people get hit by lots of stuff, and so we try and provide some of those moments. Aha. So anyway, so in the context of where we're going to come today, I'm going to give a little bit of an opening here, and then we can kind of build on that. So in the Buddhist tradition, there's this idea of the three jewels, which we have discussed at length in various episodes. I'm going to give just a quick little rundown again, just for, I guess, reference purposes. But the three jewels, not in any specific order, but in this order, how they usually call them, is the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. The Buddha is in reference not necessarily to the historical, Siddhartha character Buddha, but to your own enlightened being inside of you. And I'm not even going to call it like latent or asleep. We'll just say currently in development. I have not titled, but I have used as a footer to some letters that I have written before, DOD, Department of Development. And so this is kind of how I feel about all of this aspects of ourselves. Anyways, the Dharma is in reference to teachings. And in some translations, Dharma also means reality. So I guess we could say teachings on reality. And reality doesn't necessarily mean like the rules and boundaries of current society, but of actual reality itself. And the last one is Sangha. Sangha is most often referred to as the community, or in this case, a spiritual community. But this is both a literal and in a relative sense. The relative nature of existence is that we are all sort of interconnected with everyone and everything. And this isn't hyperbole, but exactly what I meant to say is that we're relatively connected on a level of, you can call it like a microcosmic level, right? We have our physics people here, right? So we've studied sort of Newtonian things where you look at reality as like big cue balls, pool balls that hit each other and bounce and do that thing. But then you have relative physics, which, tells us that things are sort of, they're there, but they're not there in a specific way that we had once viewed them to be when viewed on a much larger, I guess, microscopic viewpoint, right? And so what I'm saying is that like, we're going to be discussing things on sort of a macro and a micro level. On the macro level, we have a community, and it could be a spiritual community, like maybe if you go to church, there's people there, or mosque or synagogue or temple or whatever you go to, or you could be in school, or you could be at a gym, or whatever kind of, or a community center, wherever you're at, right? That's a community of people. But then we have the larger community around us, the people who we interact with at work, which is another community. But then maybe the people on the street, or the barista at the coffee shop, or the person who working at McDonald's who gets your, egg McMuffin in the morning, whatever. It's another, it's an extension of that community, but it is a community nonetheless. And so your interactions with all these people ultimately are like, I guess, expressions of yourself. And so as we're going to look at this, including your families and other community, we want to be able to highlight that, like, yes, we are all interconnected. And the understanding and realization of this and the living of this is an infinitely compassionate way to be. However, the relative side of that argument is that we are different. We are separate on a grander scale. Like, Priscilla, I'm at this moment separate from you, and you're separate from your husband and from your children. And I'm talking, the listeners are listening. There's obviously, we're not quote unquote the same, but yet we are, on a deep level. So what we're talking about is the grosser level, right? Of the cue balls smashing around and things, and the importance of two things. And then I want to give you a chance to talk. One of boundary, one of vulnerability, and then the wild card, holding space. So, oh yeah. Yeah. So
it's like, we didn't have that in the pre-talk. Like, this is literally a wild card for me too. I'm like,
right.
what?
That's right. Yeah. Because it's cool to I want to discuss it a little bit, because it's part of this, right? That's the community boundary, Anyway, so I want to give a couple definitions, and then I specifically, I want to get your opinion, reaction to the second one. Okay. But so according to, the dictionary, it says boundary, a limit of a subject or a sphere of activity. And when speaking about a personal boundary, they call it the limits and rules we set for ourselves within relationships. Pretty straightforward, okay? But then the definition, this is all from the Oxford Dictionary, of vulnerability, to me was interesting, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Vulnerability is the quality or state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, either physically or emotionally. Okay. Now, I thought that definition of vulnerability is insinuating an inherent attack, as if leaving yourself exposed means leaving yourself exposed for harm, and harm only.
Yes, but I would kind of agree with it too.
Sure.
Because I actually, in that podcast that I've been listening to with Dr. Gabor Mate, he describes vulnerability, I think, the extent of which we're willing to be wounded, like the depth of which we're willing to be wounded. And so, like, it's a state of mind, like vulnerability. It's not just about being wounded, it's about the depth, like how many layers are you willing to take off to, like the belly of an animal is vulnerable, like, because there's no bones protecting the organs there, it's soft, that's a vulnerable spot in the body. So I think of it like that, like, how many layers and how deep am I willing to get raw enough to, like, come into another relationship or face to face with another person and be willing to, like, sometimes words, like my own definitions of words can be harmful. Like, you may not have the same definition for a same word, and you say it to me. And if I'm not vulnerable enough to understand that, like, you are your own separate person, I could feel attacked about that. And sometimes we protect ourselves from that. But, like, being vulnerable to me means, like, an open state of mind to be, like, as raw as I can possibly be, like, no protection, like I said, like the soft flesh belly, underbelly of an animal, or even our own selves, which is interesting. I think the heart's an interesting place where it sits. I think it's funny that it sits behind such, like, a hard sternum in the rib cage, like there's already some, like, because I I mean, I feel like that's where we're most vulnerable. We already have like a physical protection over it. So to be vulnerable, I think it takes, it takes an awareness, it takes an effort, like for real.
Mm-hmm. And then how would you relate this idea or well, not the idea, but the sense of vulnerability with your own boundaries? I mean, we kind of talked a little bit earlier, but sharing now, it's like, to me, that seems like the protection of your vulnerability is your boundary, or are your boundaries.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, like you can't just, I feel like, yeah, you can't just walk around with like your heart out in the open for just like, because the world is harsh and it's not fair. Like, I mean, I was just on here, a couple weeks ago talking about there's, sometimes life is really unfair. So we do have to protect ourselves. Like human beings in general, like love boundaries. Like we really do. We like to know where the lines are, we think sometimes in like black and white, and so it's an exploration, like it feels safe to have boundaries. Like I feel like if you were in the middle of the woods, you would feel much safer in a brick house at 1 o'clock in the morning with howling and growling noises around you than you would with no boundaries or borders, like just in like out in the open, sleeping on the grass. There's something to say about like boundaries protecting us and then the safeness that feels like. And I don't know if it's maybe been mentioned before that I practice cranial sacral therapy. And one of the ideas about, transformation or being able to have your nervous system a certain relaxed sort of way is that you have to feel safe. And so to be vulnerable, you have to feel safe. And to feel safe, you have to have a boundary of some sort. Like, and so it's like this very weird circle. To be super open, you would have to have a contained, like I think we talked yesterday, it was like contained but not constrained, like you had mentioned that like idea. So you have to feel safe of some sort. And so by setting our own boundaries and knowing where they are, it creates safety in us. And once we feel safe, I believe that we can allow ourselves to be vulnerable, because vulnerability comes from, like, in my head, it comes from like a rest and digest, that place of the nervous system that is open and relaxed, and it's not in fight or flight or like on guard. So
so I hear what you're saying, and I agree with you on the relative level, right? And you bring up a really good point, and you worded it very correctly and very logically. And but what did you say? In order to feel vulnerable, you have to feel safe. And in order to feel safe, you have to have boundaries, right?
Well, I think boundaries helps create a safe space.
Okay.
So that's all I'm saying. It's not the only thing. I mean, there's a ton of ways to skin a cat, they say. There's tons of other resources and other ways to feel safe, for sure. But what I'm saying in general, like, it's part of, I think in general, like it's part of like, I think it's a very deep primal thing, something that like exists beyond our own understanding, that like this idea of safety or whatever, comes from, part of it can come from boundaries, So.
Yeah, I agree. On a grand level, I agree. But as we're talking, I'm like in love with my own thought, which is such a like an egoic thing to feel, but I so I'm gonna admit that.
You're fine. Give me 1 second. I'm just gonna.
Yeah. So as you're, doing your thing.
Okay, sorry. I had to turn on my power strip. It was like my
No, you're good. You're
computer
good.
was crashing power wise.
All right. So in order to feel vulnerable, in order to be vulnerable, one has to feel safe, or it's one of maybe several requirements, but it's definitely one. But the idea of feeling safe, I guess for me, intends that you are not feeling unsafe. And I know that seems like a stupid linguistic thing, but if you're not concerned, like if you don't have a concern of like your own self-preservation, then safe or unsafe is no longer part of the equation.
What do you mean? Can you say that again really quick?
Yeah, right. I know it took it. So as you're talking, I'm processing this as it's happening. Okay, so again, in order to experience vulnerability, or to feel vulnerable, to be vulnerable, one has to feel safe, right? Because according to the definition,
I mean, this is just a theory like that would make sense in my head based on my own
Right.
experiences and my own practices. Yes.
It's not, I'm right.
Yeah.
Right. But, and I think, again, according to this definition, which you agreed with, this is not
Mhm.
court. This is not court. You're good,
Oh no, I'm cool. I'm just like,
Okay. Okay.
yeah, good.
So, but like, again, according to, and according to what, Dr. Gabor said, right? Um, that like you have to have some sense of safety, right? In order to be able to go into the depths of your own vulnerability. But what I'm saying is that that's a premise that is based upon self-preservation.
Of
Because
course it is.
safety, huh?
Of course it is.
Of course it is.
Like I just said, it comes from like such a primal place that we don't even understand. Like safety is it's a primal thing. It's like being safe, like your basic needs as a human being come from such a deep-seated source of survival. It
I
comes from such a
understand.
low primal like thing.
Right, but
Absolutely.
so I'm building I'm like secretly building our conversation from the inside, most deepest seed state out that I'm not even
Okay.
aware. I'm just doing it as it's happening.
Okay.
But this idea of self-preservation is inherent in all of us. This is why we're
Yes.
alive. This is why we struggle for life.
Yeah.
But what if someone was able to transcend that limitation? They were able to transcend the idea of self-preservation. And I'm not gonna, no, listen, I'm not saying like, oh, they're gonna just jump off a bridge because they don't care. But what I'm referencing is like all these stories of like specifically of the stories of Buddha, right? The historical stories of him sacrificing himself, or the other sages sacrificing themselves for a lion to feed her cubs, or a lioness, I guess, to feed her cubs, or of the bird who carried water for a forest fire until it couldn't anymore, and its heart gave out. But I'm saying like that level of like compassion or motivated, like heart centered action transcended their desire for self-preservation. They moved beyond the boundary of continuing on with oneself. And so the idea of being vulnerable for them in those moments, whether the stories are true or not, I don't know. I'm just saying that like they were able to move beyond that. They were able to move beyond like these very primal kind of instincts, right, of keeping myself in a contained space in order to catch my next breath. And then maybe I'll make the Daniel philosophical leap and say, for procreation, right, or self-preservation, i.e. the continuing of the genetic line and influence on my society. So
Yeah.
that was my secret thought underneath the vulnerability description, is that it inherently puts that on top of the thing that we have all as human beings, and why we're able to survive as a species, which I realize is important, or else we wouldn't be here having this conversation. But on the same level, like if one of the desires of this program, podcast, project, whatever we're doing, is to illuminate as many of these unconscious processes as possible, as many of them as possible, I think this one is a very important one. It doesn't mean that you should value yourself less. No, we're talking about boundaries in a second. But like to understand that this deep seed, the seed of vulnerability, that we would extend ourselves into a space that's safe, is still based on our own ideas of self-preservation. And maybe self-preservation from a societal level is not being embarrassed by crying in front of others, or not being our authentic selves for fear of being judged and ostracized. You know what I'm saying? Or it could be on a different level of like not exposing, to your point, our stomachs or our bellies or our chests or whatever to the environment to not be eaten. But again, it's still a self-preservation standpoint, and therefore it is important to live to continue to be alive, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I think so, but like I think that like it's such a circle that it gets blurred in where you're talking about it from, in a way that like when you talk about the self-preservation part, for me, like there's only ways, like in this is my own personal belief, like
Sure.
and like you're gonna be like, stop minimizing yourself, but I'm like, I'm just a stay-at-mom at home mom over here that keeps an acupuncture license like up to date and like doesn't really like, I'm not as like, you know, I'm gonna say educated and smart as like you and Eric. Like I don't even know why you come on to help man the
You
ship.
literally,
No,
you literally went to school with me. So
I know, but what I'm saying is like, so for me, as long as we are in human form, as long as we are stuck in this vessel of flesh and bone and blood,
sure.
there's always going to be this desire to override for our own survival and our
Yes,
own personal interest.
of
And
course.
so for me, whenever I think about vulnerability, there's this idea of like, you know, I think we've talked about it in that other book that we're reading together about descending the mountain. So you go down into this primal thing, you become aware of it. You're like, oh, you're like, I recognize that like when I want to protect myself and put my guard up is whenever I'm feeling vulnerable. Like it's a survival mechanism. Like I
Yeah,
am being targeted. And
yeah,
so, and what happens is like, you can like determine when you're down there, like, is it really a threat though? Like whenever somebody like, I was just telling you the other night, like Tyler, my husband, he called me stubborn. And that word did not sit right with me and immediately made me want to like protect myself because I didn't believe it. And I
sure.
kind of felt like
Yeah.
hurt by it. And so I had all of this stuff happening inside my body that I was like, what? But like, I'm also smart enough to be like, is that really a threat? I'm about to lose an arm. And I'm like, no, it's actually not a threat. I don't need to like really protect myself. I don't need to go into like mama bear mode. And so I think when we can differentiate and we can become aware, you know, whenever these protective mechanisms want to like come up and turn on and shut off our vulnerability, and we can decide like, is it a real threat or could I work past it? Then we can function from our heart, which is like a higher place than our survival, where I believe that we exist in like just a primal, like going through protecting ourselves, kind of like wanting to live, wanting to procreate, like you said. It comes from like a higher place. So sometimes like this is the stuff that I love with, and I feel like it bleeds from my acupuncture to my cranial sacral to my yoga classes, this idea of like leading from the heart and just like making a higher decision, you know. And some of that comes from like deciding, when I said deciding if you're safe or not, is just differentiating, like, is this a real threat? Like, am I about to like seriously die, or is just my ego going to get hurt? And then when you can make that differentiation and be like, oh, like, you know, just like my ego or my own like thoughts are about to be threatened, and that's not a real threat, like there's growth there, and then you can exist in a more vulnerable space. I feel like my
No,
feelings, you know.
no, listen, I'm with you. So two things you brought up. I think one was the idea of protection. Um, First on protection, yes. So we have our defense mechanisms come up, right? And this is at this point right now, I believe this to be the ego, the personality, same, which people call ego, and they're like, oh, ego, bad, I got to kill it, you know.
Yeah,
No, that's
no.
your personality. You're gonna kill your personality. Who are you gonna be then? Like some NPC? You know what I'm saying? Like, no, it's not. However, your personality is influenced by all of your defense mechanisms that you have learned over the years, that you have acquired over the years, that have developed, you know, as the years have gone on one level, on an interpersonal level. But then on a societal level, like, yes, there should be some amount of like awareness of your surroundings and feeling like you might have to be on guard if you live in an area, which, you know, you did probably when you were, well, at different points through your life, you know, people are following you around and, you know, living in not so good spots. And, you know, we have a worldwide, you know, listenership here. And so I don't know where people are at, you know, in terms of like their physical surroundings. So I have to be cognizant of that too. Like, that's a realistic thing. But then at what level, like at what point, whether someone is physically threatening you or it's a perceived threat, what, you know, verbally, which could totally have real feelings too, you know, how much of our defenses get put up? And then when do we lower those defenses though? Right? Do we always walk around with our defenses up? Are we unable to greet another human being with a smile because we think that will be not enough protection? There was a book I was reading recently, and some guy from Baltimore was being interviewed. I'm not picking on Baltimore. That's just where the guy was from. You know, he grew up there. And he's an author, and I forgot his name. And I apologize to him, but he was like, when I was growing up, there was a very fine line of being too violent or not violent enough as a means for survival. So there's this other kind of like deeper part, right? Where like some people are in certain situations where they have to defend themselves in order to continue, their existence, which is, what we're talking about at this point. But then not doing so much that you go to jail, but not doing nothing so that, you're in some environment where you get picked on constantly. And that's this idea, I think, of boundaries. And it kind of hit me in when you were talking, like being an artist is a kind of a boundary for your like your vulnerability, like your person as a creative kind of individual is like your own little boundary. Like, I'm an artist. I'm not inherently, meaning I'm not violent. And I guess I'm talking more about like, the harder arts, like painting and, sculpting or whatever. I guess, there's plenty people talk about like, more like hip hop and things like this. They're artists, but they're totally like, some of them are definitely, going to jail for various reasons. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, so that's kind of what I wanted to add to your point. I feel like I have what I want to say, and you're helping me say it. Like that's how I feel.
Good. I mean, to your point of what you're saying, I think there's a lot of fine lines and everything. Like that's why, I don't like, like these ideas and these concepts that I have, like they're not foolproof. There's not any other way to get to them, and it's that like it is a fine line. Sometimes I imagine it like and I've told you about this like picture or this image before, but it's like the idea of holding water in your hand. Like there has to be a certain amount of tension to squeeze the fingers together to cup and hold the water. But the minute you squeeze too tight or you get too loose in the, there's no, like the boundaries of the fingers aren't touching, you lose the water, So there's this like perfect balance of like the perfect line, the perfect tension, the perfect boundary of that, A closed fist is too much. A wide palm is too far,
Yeah.
And so I think about it like that. So it's definitely situational, like when like you're talking about safety or whatever, it's like, can people that live in unsafe neighborhoods that like have threats all around them ever feel safe? Like that's something that like I can't I mean, I have lived in kind of sketch neighborhoods before, but I couldn't answer fully. I don't have lives of some people like that, I think it's possible. But like I can't say for sure, So it's situational, but I think that like these are tools, these are pathways. And then like if you want to hop on the pathway and find it, or you think that it would be good for you, you have to walk the path, you have to find your way. It's a personal thing for everybody, because everybody's traumas, everybody's experiences, everybody's ego stories that they have in their head are different. It's a different negotiation system. It's a different, my boundaries are going to be different than your boundaries are going to be different than, some of the people's listening boundaries, it's very personal.
Yeah.
So
the way that I look at it is that like, essentially our boundaries are our defensive lines. And this sometimes defense doesn't always mean offense. Defense can just simply mean no, right? Just a clear line around us. But that it's kind of like like a dimmer switch. And that if the boundary is all the way up, then you are exposing 0% vulnerability at that time. Boundaries all the way down, you're exposing 100% vulnerability. And you have this dial that gets turned higher and lower based on your situation. So when you're around your family, it's way down. When you're around somebody who you feel very intimate with, it's even lower. When you're
and I think
work,
that you're like you're saying, you were saying like, and I think it does switch all day long. And you were saying it takes practice to have that awareness, like to be able to tune into that dial and know it exists at multiple levels, and then to be able to judge the situation and like what your body is saying, and then be able to appropriately tone the dial in. And so I do think that like, there's a level of awareness and a level of practice that happens to be able to, make that appropriate dial in. So
and then and I guess like the philosophical standpoint is that like our work, is to be able to extend, relatively extend that sort of, I don't know if I want to call it vulnerability, but I'll say openness to everyone, to everybody. And it's not that I have to walk up to you, open my vulnerability meter, and then close it and walk away, then do it to the next person. It's a feeling. you know, it's a feeling that like this person is not a combatant, right? Even if they're of
Well,
course combating me, I'm going to protect myself, but like that you could sense the humanity, you can sense that or even the larger point, the soul, the being inside of that person. They're not just simply skin and bones who are a threat to my existence, a threat to my vulnerability.
yeah. I don't know if you remember when we were in school together, but we had this class, I think separately, but it was like, I think the clinical counseling class.
Sure.
And one of the exercises that we had to do was to make a list, and we had to think of three people that we, and then three people, and then like a tendency that they had that like really like repulsed us or annoyed us, like really got under our skin. And then we had to make a separate list of three people, and maybe it was the same people, maybe they had like admirable qualities and like repulsive qualities, but then like three qualities that like we could really relate to, or that like we admired so much. And then kind of the exercise at the end, when you had these like six people and these six qualities, was to be able to look at it and see if you could like honestly say that you saw those qualities, all of them, the repulsive ones and the admirable ones, in
Right.
yourself, and they're the same ones that you maybe like made you hate yourself and made you love yourself in a way. And so in general, the nervous system has like the cardiovascular system and the brain, they both have electromagnetic fields to them. So I think there's this like this electricity between human beings that we can't really see, that's maybe not palpable to like some people, maybe it is, but in general I think there's this connectivityness, and when nervous systems get around each other, they are secretly talking. And so like
Yeah.
we, you
Yep.
know, and sometimes you'll feel that like, you know, it's like without even talking, you can get close to someone and kind of like, you don't want to judge a book by its cover, but you can kind of tell like, oh, I like their vibe, or like this vibe's going to go really well with me, or like you can just like two wrong notes hitting and wrong, you know. And so but I think about that all the time whenever I encounter people that like all of a sudden I'm hearing the two different notes or whatever. I think that everybody, there's likeness and similarities, like there's the humanity, like there's this sameness in all of us of some level. And so I'm always looking for that connective piece, because if I can see myself in the other person, or the other person in me, then it does make me a little more vulnerable. It makes me want to understand like, what about this does not, you know. And like, obviously if someone has like a knife in front of you and it's a very serious, like it's totally different situation. But I'm saying in general, like, you know, you're just out and about and your friend introduces you to someone, or you're just meeting a stranger off the street that seems nice and you're chatting. Like, I'm always very curious about that, you know, because
Sure.
I do think that like there's, you know, there's so much to be learned. And I do, I always try to think that like there's a greater good in humanity.
Sure.
And that's how I try to walk in vulnerability, but also like using like my spider senses to determine like, do I need to draw a boundary here, you
Right.
know, like and so, and that's important. And that's like we were talking about, tuning into that dial and saying like, okay, like I've set my dial for this particular situation, and as the conversation flows, or as the relationship kind of navigates or grows or whatever, then I can adjust the dial. And I think that's why you were saying relationships, like it's even lower than our family, because like, you know, you take on living with your partner and you get in these spaces that like allow for more vulnerability by the experience and just the surrounding, being around these people, you know, for a
Yeah.
longer time. So
And this is all assuming that like you have good connection with your sense of vulnerability, number one, and
yes.
that like and that if you're questioning, you know, kind of like who are the deeper parts of yourself, so people who have, you know, if they're, I don't want to say hiding something, but they're working on aspects of their identity, whether that be sexual related or personality related, or, you know, just like lifestyle choices, you know, not even necessarily
Mhm.
dealing with sexual stuff, just different than their culture, not wanting to expose that to their own little, you know, sangha, their own little community, you know, that it becomes harder because then everything feels like they're on more defensive mode, you know,
Yeah.
being a woman for sure, you know, in a definitely male
Mhm.
dominated kind of society, being physically vulnerable, literally being physically vulnerable, like less strong than another physical person, you know, all changes these things and causes us to have our guard up, aka our boundaries. And
Yeah.
so I wanted to kind of like, you know, move along a little bit with our conversation here. I wanted to acknowledge the different layers where people are at first. That's why I said what I said. I'm not, you know,
Mhm.
ignorant to the strifes of different people in their life in their lives, in their life choices, and the things that they're working through, which would cause their boundaries to be up, right? And the economic stresses and things like this, that would just keep them in keep their boundaries higher, essentially, you know, so that they're in a little bit more of a reactive state. But the reaction, that's their choice, right? The
Hang on.
reaction is their choice.
Okay, go. Sorry, I just had like a light bulb come on in my brain.
Sure, that's good. Sometimes they do that.
I know. Well, because I feel like before when like our little powwow before this, you were talking about vulnerability and boundaries being yin and yang, and I didn't agree with you because I was like, I don't know if I agree with that. But like literally, I was just thinking, I was like, man, I was like, you know, boundaries make you safe, but also like no boundaries make you feel safe too. Like in a way of like, you know, sometimes like boundaries, I think like of labeling something or creating like an edge of something, and like that feels good to like know where those boundaries are.
Sure.
But then sometimes like boundaries in my head kind of get lumped in with like labeling something. And like the minute you start labeling something, like that can feel unsafe to people because it's like, oh, I'm going to be judged. Like this is a habit that I have that could be looked down upon. And so there's a threat there. So like sometimes having no boundaries, like this unconditional yielding love, which I think is where vulnerability sits. And so I'm agreeing with you now.
Yeah. I mean, and look, in a relative sense, we do like boundaries. We live in a house. That's a boundary from the outside world.
Yeah, but I believe unconditional love is like the ultimate thing that like you could be after in this lifetime. And I agree that, and I believe that unconditional love doesn't have boundaries. Like it's not defined by anything. It's
right.
You know, we talked about this all the time. Like,
but that's like it's yes, I guess in one sense, you're right. On a societal level, you have the boundary of your house, and hopefully you love the beings inside of that house. The goal is to not love only your children, but to love all children.
Yeah.
And to not only love your dog, but to love dogs. You know what I'm saying? Just in general, like my teacher, Andre, would be like, oh, you love your wife. Why don't you love all wives? Why so selfish, you know? But that's the, you know, but so the idea then of having a boundary is needed because we are working through our own things as they are, right? And so we need a respite. As you said, like we're magnetic beings, so we are sort of engaging in the environment around us, and you do need a sense of safety in life, or else you're always on edge. You're in essentially fight or flight kind of existence where you want to do one or the other. And you know, maybe it's not so extreme. Maybe it's like irritability or coldness, which we can all have experienced based on our various customer service experiences in life, you know, where you have that person who's like totally irritable and you're like, man, you must be having a bad day. Or the people where you go somewhere and you buy something and you're like, can you acknowledge the fact that I just spent money in this place? Like, hello, you know what I'm saying? Like I earned that. Like, but they're, you know, but so that's their level of reactivity. But that like having your own sense of boundary can create a respite for yourself, can create like a sanctuary in a sense that you can go and do your own recharge kind of thing, but then also that you know where other people's things stop and your things start in a sense. So you have like this two opposing forces. One is that like the drive is to overcome not overcome diversity, but overcome like diametric ideology, and that like there is you and me and feeling connectivity, but then also knowing that we are not the same, and that I do have my own sense of energy, you have your own sense of energy, and we have to find the boundaries that come in between this. And I was talking with the patient earlier today, and she has a couple kids, and you know, she's married, and there's all different kinds of dynamics, but she is always, like you said, sort of expanding out to her environment and wanting to be the people pleaser, which I think is far more of a trait that women carry more than men. I'm not saying no men carrying it, but I'm saying I think it's more nurturing in that sense, but it can be draining. And she says she feels like burnt out and she needs time to like recharge, but that she feels bad, like almost like she's abandoning her duties as a mother and as a wife, going and taking, you know, a half hour for herself to do whatever, because that feels bad. I just want to
say, I feel like this is really common and it's not talked about, which is a real big shame. Because I feel like a lot of, like, I'm a mother of 2 toddlers, and I mean, I feel the same way. Literally feel like I'm failing every day, tired, like I'm just, you know, can't find a little pocket. constantly have a list of 3 things and having to give up one of them? Like, is it like, I can eat and shower, or I can like, eat and sleep, or I can like sleep and shower, but I'm like, something's not making the list, and it's just like running every single day like that, feeling like you have to give up just like basic needs of some sort, can be really draining sometimes, and then like, I love doing this stuff with you. I love, I have like a small practice I stepped in that I like to see other people. Like, there are things that fill me up in my life, and that I still want to do. But like at the end of the day, there's usually 2 things, several things that I've sacrificed on my list. And some of them are just like basic need things that like, and I feel like a lot of women are in that position because, I don't, it's like, what do they say? Like, I just read a quote the other day on Facebook that someone had reposted from like another person and another person. It was like, this world isn't made for a working mom, and it's not made for a single income family. And it's like, it's true. And I feel like, there's so many women in that position, and just, it's, I just want to like acknowledge it and say it. And, that it's not, it's everywhere, and people, I don't think, talk about it, but it exists.
And so this idea then of having boundaries is an important one, right? And it's not to increase the sense of divisiveness between people, but the way that I look at boundaries is like a measure of your own integrity, a measure of your own energy, a measure of your own output, where you are, and how much are you willing to expand that boundary, and what is the cost of that expansion, and how are
you finding that personal boundary, and how are you knowing how to navigate it?
Right. And then we'll go there in a second. And then, and how, when you collapse that boundary, what is the cost of that? Now, those are 2 questions, but to your point, how can you answer either one if you're not aware of your own sense of being, essentially, right? Your own beingness. And this comes from, no surprise to anybody who's listened to us for any length of time, time spent in internal reflection, or I don't like to use the word contemplation, but, we'll say meditation, something like this, that you get a chance to do some physiological thing, like have your nervous system sort of be on a little bit more of an even keel, have a starting point where you're like, okay, this is what calm and relaxed feels like. Now, this varies from person to person, and depending on how long you've practiced, or if you've ever practiced, or whatever. But I think this is such an important part, because without that, how can you know the cost of expanding your boundary? How do you know when you need to rein it in a little bit so that you can reserve some energy, so that you can be a better mother, a better customer service representative, a better, whatever, police officer, bus driver, student, teacher, whatever, and without that inquiry on yourself, I don't know how well you're able to answer that question, actually, and so then I think what ends up happening is that the boundaries just become more calloused. They become thicker and thicker, and the people who are on the inner circle become increasingly less. And those are the only people you feel like you can have boundaries with, only until you meet the few small people who are able to make their way through this semi-permeable membrane. You know what I'm saying?
Can I add something to that?
Yeah, please.
I also think that, like, that everything you're saying is true, but I also think what happens when people aren't spending time in internal reflection and like knowing where these boundaries are, like the repercussions and the breakdown also can turn up in like physical, mental, and emotional distress. You know what I'm saying? And so like, it's important because like, yeah, not only are you affecting the dynamics of where those boundaries are and the thickness of that membrane or that barrier that you're talking about and the people in and out of it, but it's going to start attacking you personally. Like, you basically start becoming disconnected from your own body, basically. I feel like, like, which is very weird because like our body literally has a skin boundary. boundary. Like we are a contained situation, whether you want to believe that spirit is in this thing or not. The skin contains bones, organs, fluids, full functioning systems. So there's a boundary. There's like literally like the life of us depends on this boundary. And whenever all of a sudden you start taking on things, or you don't realize or accept that you have boundaries and then know what they are for yourself as a specific human, there is a breakdown. You get disconnected from your body. And I think that like, you know, as acupuncturists, we see a lot of people, they come in with like these pains in their body. They're like, you know, that the headaches, things that they're not sure, digestive issues, and they have no clue. And you start talking to them and you see that they're so detached from their body because they've gone on this, like, you know, they're just working and plowing away and they're just doing these things and they're in this mode and they're slightly disconnected from that internal reflection mechanism. They don't know where their own boundaries are, as a personal like kind of checklist essentially. And you see it turn up in that way too. I just want to add that.
Yeah.
Maybe you agree, maybe you don't.
No, I know that completely. That's the practitioner speaking right there, you know? And so then, you know, how is it then, you know, so spending time in internal reflection is a way in which to kind of set your set point, your point zero.
Yeah.
And then you can then have a sense of like, okay, what is affecting it? How is affecting it? What do I do? What do I need to do to recharge? You know, what does that look like? How long does that take? You know, is it days? Is it weeks? Is it minutes? Is it, you know, whatever, what affects it? Bless you.
Yeah. Thank you. Like
And so then, you know, I wanted to sort of like cap off this conversation with the idea of like, you know, new age spiritual lingo,
Oh, I like
holding space. Technically right now I am holding, so I got my hand turned up, right, like a cup, for those who are on the audio version, right? That's technically holding space, but that's not what I'm referencing.
We've been holding space for each other for almost an hour now on this Zoom call.
Correct.
We're holding space for other people right now, maybe.
Hopefully, or they're holding space for us. But so this
like
idea of holding space for somebody, all right, we'll use it in a very sort of a general term. Somebody has a rough day, maybe your partner, maybe a friend, family member, whomever, and you have them over to talk, or you call them on the phone and you chat and you're listening. You provide them with the opportunity to express themselves. You listen compassionately. Perhaps you give some feedback, maybe not, but they are able to express their vulnerabilities or their feelings or whatever it is that they have. It's probably vulnerabilities, the places in which they felt, you know, whatever, in a non-judgmental, or at least non-outwardly judgmental place, with somebody who was compassionately there for them, supporting them. That's quote unquote holding the space for someone to share, holding the space for someone to be, right? And I think microcosm and macrocosm, and then I'm right, and then I did what I did for today, you know, on a personal level, you can, in interpersonal level, intrapersonal level, you do with other people, right? With your kids, your partners, whatever. And you provide whatever they need in that moment. On a interpersonal level for yourself, I believe that those moments of respite are you holding space for yourself. And the practice of holding space for yourself gives you the opportunity to be whoever it is that you are, to be however it is that you are in your own state, right? When those moments arise. And to do that more frequently than not is very beneficial for, I believe, your mind and your heart. But then on a macro level, the idea of having faith in something, I'm not going to say what, but it's kind of like having the sense of safety or openness or trust or faith that being or thing or person or whatever is holding space for your entire life, basically, and all of reality surrounding it, which just came to me as we're talking and is like such a profound way to describe faith to me in my, you know, weird brain, you know, but like, then I think if that's my container, you know, if that is the place that's who's holding space for me, then the idea of being vulnerable takes on a little bit of a different a different meaning than just simply like showing my naughty bits to my OnlyFans.
Oh, you do that. Why you ruin such a really nice thing? You're like, oh, I'm taking myself too seriously. I said something too smart. Let me ruin it with a weird joke. You like literally think having them across the town from you, I'll snatch you right now. No, but like I think you're on to, do I have a minute to like contribute to
Yeah,
that? Or
please go ahead.
I just want to say, like, I really love what you were saying about like on the, maybe it was the micro level about like, holding space for someone else or holding space for yourself. And I think that's so important because I think that like often, to know where your boundary is, to know what did you wake up with today and what do you have to give and what can you take on? Like already, I think our own personal boundary, for me, my own personal boundary fluctuates. Sometimes I can do a lot and I can commit to a lot. And then sometimes I have to limit myself and know that I need to recharge or that I need to do things.
Sure.
And I call it, I don't want to cuss on here, but I call it eating crap. I'm like, like some days, like, with my partner, like, I can tell he's having a bad day or he needs a little extra support or whatever.
Sure.
And, I can gauge myself. And if I have, if I can gauge myself and we're both having bad days, but I feel like I have a better reserve to take care of someone or to do something, and I can be honest with myself and do it out of an acknowledgement of awareness, not do it and overextend myself and be bitter about it later. If I can honestly say like, they had a worse day than me, and I know that whenever the shoe's on the other foot and I'm worse off than them, that they're going to step up and do it. Like, so it goes back and forth about being able to sometimes, like, yeah, sometimes you're not really in a position to hold space for someone else, like, because you've had a bad day too. But I think that like what you said about on the macrocosm, leaning in, knowing that something bigger has me, that I can like function from a higher place and make that decision. It allows me to show up, and it always comes back like, it always comes back tenfold. I feel like every time I hit that spot and I do that, like, I just kind of want to go back to the part in the conversation when I was talking about Tyler calling me stubborn the other night, because it was probably around midnight and like we're laying in bed and I don't know, like, that time of night, I don't know if other women can relate, but like sometimes you get a little crazy, like women get a little bit crazy, like it gets late at night and like one thing goes wrong and like you're just like, oh, it can like set you off sometimes. You're like manic, crazy, want to just like pick a fight for an hour and a half. And so I realized that like this word like really like made me angry. I was like, because I don't believe that about myself. But then like I was able to take a moment, because I do, you and I have a meditation practice together and we do lots of ceremonies and we do a lot of work in this, I feel like, reflective space. And this reflective space has helped me personally. I was able to like stop this anger and be like, actually, I'm not really angry. My feelings just got really hurt because I don't believe that about myself. And I'm like, but I'm open to hearing why this person that lives with me, that sees me probably the rawest and like, all the time in all my ways, would say that about me, And so like, there was this moment I realized that I was hurt. And because I could recognize I was hurt, I was like, I have tools to talk about this. But then there was also that part of me, I was like, but do I really want to use them right now? And I was like, totally just like debating. I'm like, do I pick up my tool and do this work from a higher place and be kind and like talk about my vulnerability and like my hurtness? Or do I just like slaughter this person for an hour and a half and make them feel so terrible for hurting my feelings? And you know what? And whenever I was able to talk about it and be in a vulnerable space, like I really did relate to that like higher thing. I was like, man, that felt so good to be able to be nice and kind, and for me, like, that's whenever you talk about the higher thing, for me, like, I believe niceness and kindness, we need more of it in this world, and that's where the vulnerability comes from. But it doesn't mean you have to go around like a bleeding heart, extending yourself and running yourself ragged like a martyr.
Mm-hmm.
You also really have to take care of yourself and, make sure that, you're doing the same for yourself that you are for others. Like if you're going to hold yourself to the standard to do it for everybody else, you definitely need to make sure you're on the list,
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah, no, that's a good way of making something personal relatable. So thank you for
Mm-hmm.
doing it. And I'm gonna, leave everybody with the quote from the book that I was talking about, the myth of normal.
Yeah,
by Dr. Gabor Mate that we talked about in the
so
last
good.
episode.
I know.
This is not a quote from him, but it's a quote from an interview in the book. And someone said, it's possible to accept life, or it's possible to accept life for what it is and gain the authority to search for our own truth in all situations and have the agency to choose our own response to whatever occurs.
Mhm.
And I do hope that I do believe that that is something worth striving for, to be able to accept life for what it is and gain the authority to search for, who it is and who you are in every situation, and then to be able to respond accordingly in a way that you want to, just like what you had said, from the higher place, and to be able to choose your reaction. And if sometimes there is some justified anger that somebody needs in something, then you can do that and not be identified with that anger for minutes, hours, days, weeks, months. It doesn't become all of your person,
No, for sure.
because
That's
I
just
think that
human
that's,
sometimes, you know?
that's like the hard part, is like finding your own authentic reaction to something, and not having it come from a conditioned place. This is authenticity, which we talk about, a lot on here. So anyways, as always, my friend, thank you for coming on and joining us. As always, there are never, well, not never, but there are rarely clear answers, as to how to do or not do things. But,
Yeah.
really the hope, the intention, the desire is to illuminate some of these aspects of ourselves that we're living on a daily basis, that are existing, whether or not we're paying attention to them. And, to be able to get people to think about them and how it is that they might, not necessarily improve, but at least reflect upon these things so that they can make the choices that are beneficial to themselves, the people around them, and ultimately into the world. Yeah.
And greatly said. Perfect.
Perfect.
100%. A plus plus.
All right, great. Well, Priscilla, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for
As
having me.
always, people who've been here forever and a day, I definitely appreciate it. We are, approaching our 3-year mark as doing this. And, for people who, whether you're new or been listening for a while, I appreciate it. We're broadcasting from Chicago, Illinois, in the United States, but we have people, all over the world. And so, from wherever you're at, I wish you well, and thank you for tuning in. If you like our work or you don't like our work, whatever, share. That always helps.
We love constructive criticism.
Yeah, no doubt. And for such constructive criticism, or even nice words, feel free to hit us up at ginandtantra@gmail.com, or you can leave a link in the YouTube section, or a comment in the YouTube section. Subscribe, like, all that other jazz. Yeah, for Priscilla and for Eric, who's in absentia, this is Daniel. We'll catch you guys in the next one.
Bye,
Peace.
guys.